The Kaiser was fascinated with the sea. As a child, his most pleasant memories had been those of playing at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, the seaside estate of his grandmother, Queen Victoria. At nearby Portsmouth Harbour, he often saw ships of all classes. There awoke in me the wish to build ships of my own like these someday, and when I grow up to possess as fine a navy as the English. On the death of his father, Kaiser Friedrich III, in 1888, Wilhelm was crowned emperor of the most dynamic nation on the continent of Europe, an empire which had been developed largely through the political genius of its chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, and by the power of the Prussian army. Wilhelm was a reactionary at home and a believer in the expansion of German power abroad, and many people surrounding him supported his view that Germany should have a larger share in world affairs. Its industry was achieving parity with Great Britain, so why should not economic power be turned to political power on the world stage? And what better symbol of world power than that of a world-class navy? After Bismarck's fall from power in 1892, the path lay open for the new Kaiser and his supporters. From 1900, they moved to build up German naval and land strength, whatever the consequences. In 1906, the British launched the first Dreadnought, a craft which rendered all existing craft obsolete. John Fisher, the Admiralty Sea Lord, thought that the cost of building the new battleships and adapting her docks to handle them would render their feasibility. The Kaiser, adamant he should not fall, commenced to build dreadnoughts. The German fleet was ordered to double in size, pleasing both prophets of naval power like Admiral Tirpitz and the industrialists who got the orders. An arms race was underway, with Britain and Germany set on a collision course to determine which nation would dominate Northwest Europe. Few of the weapons used during the First World War exercised a more profound effect on the conduct of hostilities than the submarine, and the country most associated with wartime development of the submarine was Germany. The submarine war was divided into two distinct campaigns, that waged against surface warships and that waged against merchant shipping. At the start of the war, naval planners thought almost entirely in terms of the first, and several early German successes inspired a lasting fear of submarines in surface fleet commanders, making them loath to risk their ships in enemy waters. In terms of actual losses, however, the submarine made little impact on major naval forces. Submarine operations against merchant shipping were not widely envisaged at the opening of the war, as naval conventions required the crew of an intercepted vessel to be placed in a safe position before the vessel could be sunk. The practice of launching a torpedo attack without giving prior warning emerged haltingly, and it was not really until the second half of the war that unrestricted submarine warfare became a general rule. The sinking of the Lusitania was the most prominent of hundreds of encounters between U-boats and Allied neutral shipping. The Lusitania was attacked and went down on the 7th of May 1915 in the Irish Sea, with a loss of 1,200 civilians. The German Navy struck a Medal of Honor to the U-boat crew, and Allied propaganda dwelled on both the event and commemorations. Amongst the casualties lost were 128 Americans. And this act was to prove a pivotal moment in tipping American feeling away from isolationism towards direct involvement in the war. In 1917, Germany, armed with 100 vessels, embarked on a campaign aimed to bring Britain to its knees. Initially, this tactic looked like it might work. Allied shipping losses averaged at 630,000 tons per month and peaked at 866,000 tons in April of that year. These losses led to the introduction of the convoy system by the Allies, a move that was resisted by the Admiralty, who wanted to retain their surface fleet for more traditional duties. By early 1918, the Germans were clearly losing the submarine war, and month by month, the flow of military and non-military supplies into Britain grew steadily in volume. The U-boat could not reverse the course of the war or save Germany from eventual defeat. After the opening few months of the war, during which there were small naval encounters in distant waters, the focus of surface naval war moved to European waters. The Battle of Jutland, fought at the end of May 1916, was the only full-scale fleet action of the First World War. Admiral Hipper headed out to the North Sea with 5 battlecruisers, heading a fleet of 16 modern battleships, led by Admiral von Scheer. They were attempting to draw the Royal Navy out of their base in England. The two fleets engaged at a combined speed of 80 kilometers per hour. It soon became clear that the German gunnery was superior to that of the Royal Navy. 4 of the British battle cruisers were badly hit, and another blown up and sunk. British supporting battleships arrived at the scene and began to pound the German fleet. But this did not stop the German battleships. They fought back and sank yet another British battlecruiser. The battle raged for 90 minutes. Both sides were engaged in heavy gunfire and complicated maneuvering of their ships. Despite the superior gunnery of the German fleet, they were heavily outnumbered, and it was this that made von Scheer decide to make an early turn. Although the Royal Navy won this battle on tactical grounds, their losses were far higher than Germany's Imperial Navy. The German Navy never risked their fleet in open conflict for the remainder of the war. On the 28th of October 1918, the German authorities ordered the fleet to be assembled at Wilhelmshaven to put to sea and make a cruiser raid in the English Channel. This latest order seemed a lunatic gesture by officers more interested in saving their reputations than the lives of their men. The morale of the sailors was perilously low. They resented the arrogance of their officers, the strictness of naval discipline, and the disparity of rations between officers and men. The men of 2 cruisers, Thuringen and Helgoland, mutinied and doused their ships' boilers. On the 4th of November, dock workers and the local garrison in Kiel joined the mutinous sailors and set up their own workers' and soldiers' councils. The sailors' councils were not disloyal to the government, though, and were met by a government representative who reassured the men that there would be no suicide offensive and promised better conditions for naval ratings, the ending of a state of siege, and the liberation of all prisoners. In 1918, with the war lost, the German High Seas Fleet sailed into the British base at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys to surrender. The ships were impounded, but the German Imperial Navy was to deliver its final blow to the British. They scuttled the entire fleet of battleships, battle cruisers, and destroyers. Admiral von Reuter's decision to scuttle the fleet cost Germany its battleships, but the success of the operation served to take the sting out of the peace treaty when it was signed a week later at the Palace of Versailles. Part of the treaty stipulated that Germany had to give up her battleships and cruisers. Thanks to von Reuter, however, the majority of that fleet were destroyed, and the victors had to leave Versailles empty-handed. At the end of the war, the rest of the mighty German fleet was disbanded under the terms of the armistice, allowing her to keep only a few minor ships for coastal defense. Any new ships built were to be restricted in size. Thus, any navy that Germany had would be far smaller than that of any other countries. When the Second World War came, the part played by sea power was not so different from the part played during the 1914-18 conflict. Its prime role remained in securing the oceans and denying them to the opposing fleets, in order to ensure that the maritime communications could be maintained. Thus, navies were still centered around the battle fleets, and at the outbreak of war, the battleships remained their primary vessel. In the build-up to the war, Hitler had ordered that the German Navy be strong enough to challenge the British and embarked on a major construction program. In contradiction to this plan, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the naval commander-in-chief, felt that such a plan would be hopeless and that Germany could never match the strength of the Royal Navy on the surface. Instead, he opted for a plan of U-boat construction to cut Britain's maritime lines. The German naval expansion program, Plan Z, therefore represented a compromise. There would be some new battleships and also a major refit of the existing fleet. The Schleswig-Holstein was the last of the pre-Dreadnought battleships. And by the outbreak of war, the ship was considered almost obsolete. She had been deployed in the Polish campaign and was used extensively to bombard the port areas, such as here in the port of Danzig. The ship had sailed into the port with storm troops hidden below decks. During the attack, the bombardment lasted all day and continued through the night. The Polish port, which was being used as an ammunition depot, was heavily defended. Finally, after a very gallant defense, the Poles capitulated. Her task completed, the Schleswig-Holstein moved out into the Gulf of Danzig to continue bombarding other shore defenses at Oxhoft and Hela and Heisternest, where she was joined by her sister ship, the Schlesien. This left the way clear for the troop ships to pour into Danzig. Danzig had been part of Germany until the end of the First World War, and Hitler had been determined that it should be returned to the Reich, taken by force if necessary. On the 2nd of September, Hitler had indicated to the Western Allies that he would withdraw from Poland, provided that he was allowed to retain Danzig and the Polish corridor. Raeder was summoned to the Reich Chancellery on the morning of the 3rd of September and informed that the British had declared war on Germany. Hitler was embarrassed by this judgment of the British response to the attack and admitted apologetically, "I was not able to avoid war with England after all." Raeder observed bluntly, "The surface forces are so inferior in numbers to those of the British fleet that, even at full strength, they can do no more than show that they know how to die gallantly." The Admiral Graf Spee was the third of Germany's pocket battleships, but was to become the most famous. On the 13th of December 1939, while raiding merchant ships in the South Atlantic Ocean, she was challenged off Montevideo by the British cruisers Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter. The battle that followed highlighted the fundamental weakness of the Panzerschiff concept, for the Admiral Graf Spee was not fast enough to dodge the faster cruisers, and her triple 11-inch turrets could not cope with the three fast-moving targets. Although she crippled the Exeter, the Admiral Graf Spee was damaged in the fighting and was forced to put into Montevideo harbor for repairs. Skillful bluffing by the British created the impression that powerful forces were close at hand. Langsdorff was instructed by Hitler to avoid the humiliation of the surrendering of his ship. So on the 17th of December, the ship was scuttled in Uruguayan territorial waters. Under the captaincy of Langsdorff, the Admiral Graf Spee sank 9 ships, totaling over 50,000 tons. Not a single civilian, officer, seaman, or passenger lost their lives at his hands. In a last letter, written moments before he took his life, he revealed, "A captain with a sense of honor cannot separate his own fate from that of his ship, and I can only prove by my death that the fighting services of the Third Reich were ready to die for the honor of the flag." The Scharnhorst was launched on the 3rd of October 1936. This fast and robust vessel weighed 32,000 tons. Her sister ship, the Gneisenau, was launched 2 months later. These 2 new ships gave a new slant to the definition of a battleship by sacrificing armor plating to secure high speed. The Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau spent the first part of the war at sea, plaguing the merchant shipping convoys in the North Atlantic. In November 1939, they intercepted a convoy off the coast of Iceland, escorted by the armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi. She was sunk by the Scharnhorst to enable the convoy to escape. Both the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau gave the British home fleet the slip and returned safely to port.
The goal of the whole business was a trade war. We were not the first battleship in the Atlantic. The Panzerschiffs, which were later renamed the Admiral Scheer and the Graf Spee, had already been active before us. The Scheer was our example, as it had been very successful, and we were ordered to carry out our attacks using the same methods. This meant to set sail and find as many convoys and merchant ships as possible, and to either destroy them or capture them and bring them back to port. Well, the British had already added armored merchant ships to their convoys as protection, and these were armed. And sometimes they were protected with battleships or cruisers. We wouldn't always risk going into battle against a ship which may have had better armament than ours. This could have had severe consequences. This would only result in us losing our ship or bringing them back battle-damaged, and this would have taken us out of the war either for good or whilst being repaired. We had many ships around us in our battle fleets, which were used for reconnaissance. We also had our aircraft. These would search the seas for the convoys, and in particular those without escorts, although sometimes the merchant ships were disguised and had hidden guns. Unfortunately, most of the ships or convoys that were sailing without escorts were ships that were not carrying any significant or important loads, or were empty. But that didn't stop us. Before we would engage and start to shoot, we would always give the convoy the opportunity to stop and surrender. We attacked the ones which hoisted the war flag or sent out Morse or radio signals for help. We did capture quite a few ships. Most times we operated independently. In fact, both the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau acted independently of each other. But both ships came under the direct orders of the battle fleet commander. Although we were in the same fleet, we rarely came into contact, unless it was to receive new orders concerning posts or reconnaissance areas. During the campaign in the Atlantic, we were at sea for 9 weeks.
On the 7th of April 1940, Britain's Royal Air Force spotted German merchant ships steaming north towards Norway. They were headed for the ports of Narvik and Trondheim. Each of the ships, disguised as coal ships, were packed with stormtroopers and assault troops. Germany was about to invade Norway. Amongst the fleet were the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. There were also 2/3 of Germany's U-boat fleet deployed to protect the troop ships. Although being spotted by the RAF, fog and low cloud had helped to mask the ships, and although the British home fleet had been alerted, they were slow to respond to the possible threat. The convoys reached their destinations relatively unhindered, although one of the merchant ships had been sunk by a Polish submarine. One British destroyer, which had also managed to intercept the fleet, was rammed by the German cruiser Hipper, which sent her to the bottom of the North Sea. German seaborne troops made 5 separate landings in Norway, at Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik, whilst airborne troops seized the airfield at Stavanger. Apart from the loss of the Blucher, all other German objectives were taken with relatively little resistance from the Norwegians. However, by the time of the invasion on the 9th of April, the British home fleet had almost caught up with the German fleet, and whilst the troops were being landed safely, there were soon to be ferocious battles going on at sea. Both German and British losses were going to be heavy.
We were on the occupation of Norway, which took place in April 1940. Normally, we would hear rumors which would spread over the ship before any orders came. But this time, most of us were taken completely by surprise when the order was given. We just set sail all of a sudden with hardly any warning given. All of the ships were fully loaded, and we had a fleet of destroyers with us. These destroyers were packed full of ammunition, lancers and equipment. We sailed up the coast of Norway, and then en route we were told that our destination was to be Narvik. Our job was to travel with the destroyers to the port, protect them whilst they went in and the troops disembarked and all of the ammunition and equipment was unloaded, and then protect them on the way out again. The journey up was pretty rough. There was a gale blowing and the seas were running high. It was worse for the destroyers. It got so rough at one point that equipment was falling overboard. And not just equipment. Some men went overboard as well. It was that rough. Well, we finally took the destroyers in to Narvik, and they unloaded. Whilst we were waiting for them to come back out, we were attacked. It was early morning and still dark, and the British fleet had caught up with us. The battleship Renown, we fought with her for about 2 hours. The Gneisenau was also involved. We managed to get away and sailed towards our destroyers as we had to get them out safely. However, we heard that it would no longer be necessary as the British had caught them on the way out, and they were all lost. The missions we were on during the Norwegian campaign, and I did 5 more of these, usually lasted about a week. Sometimes they would last 3 weeks, and the longest one we did lasted for 9 weeks, which is a long time on the Atlantic. We sailed 18,000 nautical miles.
In June 1940, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau were sent north with an order to carry out an attack in the north of Norway. The Norwegian campaign was drawing to a close. With the evacuation of Allied troops from Narvik, Germany now had a strong foothold on the whole country. The German fleet were intending to intercept the ships carrying the retreating Allied forces. En route, the German cruiser, Prince Eugen, engaged one of the empty British transport ships which was en route to Narvik, but had allowed an accompanying hospital ship to continue its journey. The British Home Fleet had deployed some of its capital ships to the area for protection, including the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau spotted the smoke cloud from the Glorious at a distance of about 30 kilometers. Accompanying the carrier were British destroyers. The 2 German battleships moved in to engage the British. From a distance of 29 kilometers, the Scharnhorst opened fire. The German gunnery was efficient and effective, and within minutes, the Glorious took a direct hit. She started to burn, which meant that she could no longer launch her aircraft. The 2 destroyers accompanying the carrier moved in close to protect her and opened fire on the German ships. The distance between the opposing forces was by now closing. As the Glorious began to sink, the 2 destroyers fought a fierce battle. However, the first one was soon sunk. The second one, the Ardent, was hit and sunk, but not before letting loose 4 torpedoes. The Scharnhorst took a direct hit on the starboard side, gouging a hole 4 meters by 10 meters under one of the main towers.
The ship was severely damaged. We didn't know quite how much until later, but we did know it was serious. The middle engine had been damaged and flooded, and the turbine was no longer working. Fortunately, we did manage to get to Trondheim with just one engine, but we could hear the main shaft knocking loudly, and we only just made it.
Following a period of repair at Brest, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, along with the Prince Eugen and accompanying destroyers, were to make one of the most dramatic breakouts of the war. They boldly sailed at full speed through the English Channel.
After the ship had been in Brest for repairs, we had new orders. The trade war in the Atlantic was becoming increasingly difficult, and whilst we were holed up in Brest, we knew that we were in range of the British bombers, and they knew we were there. It was necessary for the whole fleet to break out before we were attacked. There were three options open to us as we could see it. We could either sail to the Mediterranean, going via Denmark, or we could try and sail up past Norway, back to the safety of the Bay of Germany. Or we could dash out through the English Channel, and this seemed the best option. The British, however, were expecting this, and did everything they could to make the channel impassable. However, we took the chance, and much to the disbelief of the British, we made a dash from the harbor. There was an attack from the bombers, but it was a cloudy night, and they were not successful in stopping us. Somehow we were just very lucky. And it was not until we got to the most narrow point in the channel at Dover-Calais that we were spotted again. They attacked us with their land battery. But this was no good, as we were just out of range of their guns. Then the aircraft arrived. All around us, the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau, Prince Eugen, and our destroyers and torpedo aircraft, we were all shooting like mad. The British also sent some torpedo aircraft. These approached us very bravely and made a gallant effort to attack us. But they were too slow. They didn't get a chance to fire one torpedo. We shot down every one of them with our anti-aircraft batteries. By this time, luck was once again on our side. The Luftwaffe arrived and kept the British fighters and bombers busy, and shot down many of the RAF aircraft. All of our ships managed to break out of the channel undamaged.
The Scharnhorst continued for the next 2 years plaguing Allied shipping, but in December 1944, her end was in sight. During the Battle of the North Cape, she was engaged and sunk by British cruisers, and only 36 of her crew survived. On the 14th of February 1939, the massive hull of an unfinished German warship slid into the water at Hamburg. The Bismarck. For the Nazi Party, this was a day to celebrate the new might of German war power. A moment that was enjoyed by the Führer himself. This was to be one of the strongest, largest, most powerful and most modern battleships of all the world's navies. However, the legend of the Bismarck is one that spans a mere 277 days. Only 277 days from its launching to its sinking. And yet the gigantic Bismarck was responsible for one of the most gripping dramas to take place at sea during World War II. During that short span of time, it was the most powerful battleship in the world. On board was the most up-to-date and most superior technology available. Its massive array of weapons and the extremely high level of its crew's training made this ship a seemingly invincible war machine. The sea power of the Bismarck now stood between Germany and victory, and no navy in the world had ever engaged an enemy warship like her.
Just before the summer of 1940, I was ordered to the battleship Bismarck. We spent the next few weeks getting to know the ship inside out, learning where everything was and how the ship ran. Next, we were allocated to our positions. I was ordered to join the 15-inch artillery, the middle artillery, and I was trained how to use the guns and how to work the ammunition chamber and all aspects of this station. And then we set sail. We were ordered to run a series of tests and trials for the new ship in the Baltic Sea. Our job was checking the guns, calibration, and firing with blanks. With practice and getting to know the guns, we managed to achieve a salvo rate 1 round every 6 seconds. Considering the size of our heavy artillery, this was pretty good.
The British had been waiting for the Bismarck to make its move, and as the mighty battleship slid past the coastline of Norway, she was spotted. A signal was transmitted to the Admiralty building in London. A Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft was sent to confirm the sighting. The aerial photographs were sent back to London, and the sighting was confirmed. It was definitely the Bismarck. She was lying at anchor, hidden in deep fog in a fjord, whilst her accompanying ships took on fuel.
Und sind dann ausgelaufen.
Nobody on board knew that we had been spotted by the Royal Air Force. And consequently, we were unaware that Britain knew we were coming.
Air Force. Und die Meldung war schon lange in England, wie wir ausgelaufen sind.
We sailed into the Denmark Strait on the 22nd, and this was when we had the first encounter with 2 British cruisers.
Die erste Verbindung gekriegt mit englischen Kreuzer.
All of a sudden, these 2 British cruisers came out of the fog. We were given permission to open fire. But then the 2 cruisers disappeared again into the fog, so we couldn't see them to hit them with our guns. The British also had radar, just as we did. And here, the commander of our fleet made a mistake. He assumed that the cruisers hadn't seen us visually, and that although their radar beams might have hit our ship, they did not reflect back to the British cruisers, as this type of radar was ineffective at this time.
This belief, however, was incorrect. The British cruisers, Suffolk and Norfolk, had seen Bismarck accompanied by the Prince Eugen and already knew her whereabouts from the previous signal. The new position was transmitted back to London. As Bismarck continued, a message was sent to the battleship Hood, giving them coordinates and orders to intercept and engage the Bismarck. The Hood at this time was Britain's capital ship and most closely comparable to Bismarck. Although aging, she was still the most powerful ship in the Royal Navy and was considered to be a worthy adversary of the Bismarck. The Hood, together with the Prince of Wales and 6 destroyers, set off to cut off the enemy at the Denmark Strait. The ships closed fast on each other and prepared to do battle. In the first exchange, the Hood and the Prince of Wales opened fire with the Bismarck and Prince Eugen returning fire immediately. In the first minute, a shell from the Prince Eugen hit the Hood, starting a fire which rapidly spread forward, setting the whole ship ablaze. A huge explosion followed moments later. The Hood sank within minutes, having only fired 5 or 6 salvos in the whole exchange. Of its crew of over 1,400 men, only 3 survived. With the Hood destroyed, the Bismarck and Prince Eugen turned their guns on the Prince of Wales. She was also hit and forced to break off any further offensive action. Meanwhile, the Bismarck, along with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, steamed north and then west through Danish waters.
Well, we had taken 3 hits against the Hood. 1 in the engine room, 1 in the front of the ship, and 1 in the launch position. 1 of the crew had died in the battle. We sailed a bit further, and then it was decided that the Prince Eugen should carry on towards Greenland. And we, the Bismarck, would try to make a dash to Brest for repairs. The problem we had was that the welded seam between the backboard and the second boiler room was seriously damaged and water was coming in. We were all on the alert and were kept very busy. When water comes into a ship, as you can imagine, this is the worst that can happen. People start to panic. Later, after this, things started to settle down, and we went back to our normal combat posts, and the ship steamed on.
But for the British, the hunt was on. Catalinas took off to join in the search. Somewhere in the dense cloud and fog, they knew the Bismarck was steaming at full power to reach a safe haven. As the Catalina scoured the ocean, there came a break in the clouds. A telltale wake of a ship was spotted. As the ship came into view, the signal was flashed back to the fleet. The target had been sighted. Within minutes, the Ark Royal, together with the Force H, drew close and reported the position. The weather was particularly bad in the vicinity of the target, but the crews were told no other ship was in the area. The order was flashed to the Sheffield to find and shadow the Bismarck. The Ark Royal never noticed her departure. The aircraft of the Ark Royal, flying in difficult conditions, picked up a ship on their radar, roughly in the position where the Bismarck was expected. Assuming it to be the Bismarck, they pressed their attack, but on the Sheffield. But fortune was turning against the Bismarck. On board the Ark Royal, the returning aircraft were rearmed and refueled. In heavy rain, the Swordfish took off for the second attack.
On the 26th in the evening, we were attacked for the first time by the British Swordfish, the torpedo aircraft. Later in the night, a second attack came, and this time they were more successful. We got hit. We had tried to evade the aircraft and torpedoes, but on this time we took a hit in the rudder. It was badly damaged. It was bent about 12 degrees, and after this we could only sail about 8 miles straight with the help of the engines working against the rudder. We were helpless. We must have been about 6 hours ahead of the British fleet, but because we could not escape, only go in large circles, they caught up with us. At about 6 a.m., they caught us. We tried to accelerate away, but it was useless. We could only travel in a circle, about a 12-degree radius. It wasn't long before we all realized that we had become a sitting target for the British fleet.
Ein Zielschiff der englischen Flotte wurde.
The British fleet, with the Dorsetshire, the King George V and the Rodney, closed in on the crippled Bismarck and opened fire. For 1 full hour, the relentless British salvos continued.
We took 2 direct hits on the front of the ship. The tower crew came up top and warned us to get away as quickly as possible, as the tower was about to explode at any minute. The ship's guard sounded the order for the crew to retreat. We ran back to the part of the ship where our quarters were. We were below deck. There was panic everywhere. The crew from the operating rooms, the ones that manned the boilers and turbines, had been given the signal Measure V. The V meant versunken, sinking. We had 15 minutes to abandon ship. I tried to open the hatchway. This was impossible because the flax had fallen on top of it. I shouted out for someone above to try and move them, which luckily somebody did hear, and they were moved. I let the other comrades out first and made sure the room was clear. Then there was another direct hit on the deck. We lost so many men, and many more were badly injured. Then I managed to get to the backboard side. This was a mistake on my part. The water was pouring in. I had to pull myself up higher out of the water and get to the next level up the ship. You cannot imagine or believe what I saw. I was on the deck in front of the Caesar Tower. There were at least 50, probably more like 100 dead bodies. You just cannot imagine such a sight.
In all, 111 men from the Bismarck were saved, but almost 2,000, including all of her officers, had perished. The Lutzow was launched under the name Deutschland. But in February 1940, Hitler decided that the loss of a ship called after Germany would be a bad omen. So the name was then changed to the Lutzow. In 1940, she took part in the Norwegian campaign before sailing further north to threaten Allied convoys to Russia. In December 1940, she and the Admiral Hipper took part in a raid against a convoy defended by 8 destroyers. The destroyers put up a formidable defense in what became known as the Battle of the Barents Sea. Finally, the battleships were forced to abandon the raid. Hitler was furious at such a disappointing performance and threatened to disband the Navy altogether. Relations between the Führer and his Grand Admiral had reached breaking point. Raeder resigned and was replaced by Admiral Dönitz. The Lützow was sent to the Baltic for training duty, but later operated as support for the army against the Russians in the eastern Baltic. 2 months after the Bismarck had been launched, her sister ship, the Tirpitz, had rolled down the slipway. At 52,600 tons, the Tirpitz was 2,000 tons heavier than the Bismarck and had a larger armament and crew. She had been deployed to Norway in 1942. The numerous fjords gave her plenty of relatively safe anchorages. In September 1943, British midget submarines known as X-craft had managed to get into her fjord and damage the Tirpitz with limpet mines, although all of the X-craft were lost in the process. In April 1944, British carrier-borne aircraft launched an attack on her. Once again she was damaged, but once again not significantly. Finally, during the autumn of 1944, 2 of Bomber Command's crack squadrons attacked the Tirpitz on 3 separate raids. On the 12th of November, they damaged her so severely that she capsized. The last of Germany's big battleships had met her end. The Kriegsmarine's battleships fought a long, hard, chivalrous war. The Graf Spee had set sail a full 10 days before the invasion of Poland, while the Lützow was still firing her guns at the advancing troops 4 days after the Führer's death. Yet not one of Germany's great battleships was destined to survive the conflict. On the 4th of September 1939, 112 passengers and crew of the SS Athenia were lost at sea, the first victims to German submarine war. That marked the start of the longest campaign of the war, a war that was to exact heavy losses on both sides. Between September 1939 and May 1945, U-boats sank 2,603 merchant ships and 175 Allied warships. Over 30,000 sailors manning the Allied convoys died at sea. In return, of the 1,162 U-boats built during the war, 784 were sunk. And out of the 40,900 men in the U-boat service, nearly 26,000 were lost at sea. Despite the appalling losses suffered, the morale of the U-boat arm remained very high. In May 1943, they suffered so heavy a defeat that they had to be withdrawn from the Battle of the Atlantic. But as soon as new tactics and weapons were ready, the battle was on again. A similar comeback was planned for 1945, but was stopped when the Allied armies overtook the shipyards and centers of production.